She stood in the middle of Harlan's general store with an empty basket and a son tugging at her coat, and the merchant looked her dead in the eye and said, "I don't extend credit to women who can't pay." Every person in that store heard it. Nobody moved. Eleanor Ridge didn't cry, not there, not in front of them, but her hands were shaking when she walked out into the cold. She was 31 years old. Her husband had been dead 14 months. Her boy hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days, and winter was just getting started. If you've ever watched someone swallow their pride just to survive another week, stay with me. This story is for you. Like this video, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far Eleanor's story travels. The cold came early to Burnt Creek that year. By the second week of October, the kind of frost that usually waited until November had already moved in across the Wyoming flats, settling hard into the ground and turning the creek mud to something that cracked under your boots like old glass. The cottonwoods along the ridge had gone bare faster than anyone could remember, and the old-timers in town, men who'd spent 40 years reading the sky and the soil, were already shaking their heads and saying it was going to be a long one. Eleanor Ridge didn't need the old-timers to tell her that. She could feel it in the walls of the cabin, in the way the gaps her husband Thomas had always meant to caulk let in cold air that cut right through the wool blanket she'd hung over the window. She could feel it in her knees when she got up before dawn to start the stove, and she could feel it most of all in the hollow way her son Noah looked at her sometimes across the table, not with accusation, because he wasn't that kind of boy, but with a quiet, watchful patience that no 8-year-old should have had to learn. She'd been rationing the cornmeal for 2 weeks. Not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm him. She'd been careful about that, always making sure his bowl looked full even when hers didn't, always finding some reason to say she wasn't hungry that morning, that she'd eaten earlier, that her stomach was off. Noah believed her the first few times. She wasn't sure he believed her anymore, but he was a gentle-natured child and he didn't push. What he did do, the morning she decided to ride into Harlan's, was sit up at the table before she'd even gotten her coat on and look at her with those serious gray eyes. Thomas's eyes, every time she looked at them, it still caught her off guard, and say, "Can I come?" "Not today, baby. I can carry things." "I know you can." She buttoned her coat without looking at him. "I need you to stay and watch the fire. Make sure it doesn't go out." He accepted this the way he accepted most things she told him, quietly, with a nod, already calculating how to make the best of it. He was 8 years old, and he'd already learned that arguing with his mother when she had that particular look on her face was a waste of energy. Eleanor pulled on her hat, kissed the top of his head, and walked out into the cold before she could let herself think too hard about what she was going to do. The ride into Burnt Creek took 40 minutes on a good day. That morning, with the wind picking up off the flats and the gray sky pressing down like a lid, it felt longer. Eleanor rode with her shoulders hunched and her mind working through the numbers for what felt like the 100th time, as though repetition might somehow change them. She had $11.30 in the tin box under the floorboard. That was it. That was everything. The money from selling Thomas's good saddle in August had kept them through September. The chickens had given her a little, enough for salt, flour, a few essentials. But 2 had died in the last cold snap, and the others weren't laying reliably anymore. The cow was dry. The garden had come up thin this year, nothing like the yields Thomas used to manage, and what she'd put up in jars wasn't going to last the winter if she was honest with herself. She needed credit at Harlan's, just enough to get through until she could figure something else out. She'd heard that other families in the area carried accounts with old Harlan Price. Nothing unusual about it. People on the frontier lived on tick half the time. Everyone understood that. She'd never asked before. Even after Thomas died, even in the worst months, she'd found ways to manage without asking. She told herself it was pride. Now she understood it was fear. Fear of exactly the conversation she was about to have. Harlan Price's general store was the largest building in Burnt Creek, which didn't mean much. The whole town was 7 structures and a livery. But it was the only place within 30 miles to buy provisions, and Harlan knew it. He was a wide man, somewhere in his 60s, with a mustache he kept waxed and the kind of careful pleasantness that people use when they want to seem friendly without actually being so. He'd been polite to Eleanor in the months after Thomas's funeral, brought a ham to the burial, said all the right things, but politeness cost nothing, And Eleanor had learned over the past year that it didn't always mean much either. She tied her horse at the post, took the basket off the saddle, and went inside. The store was warm and smelled of tobacco and sawdust. There were 3 other people inside: Margaret Tillis from the Tillis farm south of town, her daughter Ida, and a man Eleanor didn't recognize who was examining rifle cartridges near the back wall. Eleanor nodded to Margaret, got a nod back, and went to the counter. Harlan looked up from his ledger. "Mrs. Ridge, what can I do for you?" She'd rehearsed this. She'd spent the whole ride in rehearsing it, keeping her voice steady, keeping it businesslike, explaining the situation clearly without sounding desperate. She told him she needed provisions: cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, coffee if he had it, and that she was hoping to extend a small account until spring. She mentioned that she had a milk cow she expected to come back into production, that she was planning to sell off some timber from the East Ridge, that she was a reliable person and she'd pay every cent. Harlan listened with his hands flat on the counter. He didn't write anything down. When she finished, he let a beat of silence pass, the kind of silence that was its own answer. And then he said, "I don't extend credit to women who can't pay." Eleanor heard it. Margaret Tillis heard it. The man near the back wall with the rifle cartridges heard it because she saw his head come up slightly. The whole store went very quiet. "I said I would pay," Eleanor said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "Mrs. Ridge." Harlan's tone was the careful, pleasant one again, the one that wanted to seem like reason. "You're a widow. Your husband left you with a homestead that, from what I hear, ain't producing much. You got 1 child and no man to work the land. Now I sympathize with your situation, I truly do. But I run a business, not a charity, and I can't afford to extend accounts to folks who got no clear means of paying them back." "I have means," she said. "I just told you." "You told me what you're hoping to do." He leaned back slightly. "Hoping ain't paying." She stood there for a second with the basket in her hand and the words in her throat, and every eye in the store on her. She could feel Margaret Tillis looking at her. She could feel the man near the back wall pretending not to. She thought about Noah at the cabin watching the fire, believing she was going to come home with something, and she thought about the cornmeal situation and the empty shelves and the tin box with $11 in it, and she had a sudden, violent urge to put the basket down on Harlan's counter and walk out without saying another word. That's what she did. She set the basket on the counter, not hard, not dramatically, just set it down. And she walked out of Harlan's general store and stood in the cold wind of the Burnt Creek Main Street and breathed through her nose until the shaking in her hands stopped enough that she could trust herself to untie her horse without dropping the reins. She didn't cry. She'd made that decision 14 months ago when they put Thomas in the ground. She was not going to cry in public in this town, not in front of people who'd be kind to her face and talk about her behind her back. She tied her jaw and untied her horse and was just swinging herself up into the saddle when a voice came from behind her. "Ma'am." She almost didn't turn around. She was so tired of the word ma'am, tired of the sympathetic looks, the carefully worded condolences, the casseroles that people brought in the first month and then stopped bringing once they'd satisfied their sense of obligation. But something in the voice made her turn. It wasn't soft or condescending. It was just plain, like he was talking to a person. The man was standing a few feet back from the store door, the one who'd been looking at rifle cartridges. She hadn't gotten a good look at him inside, but now she saw he was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean in the way of a man who worked outside and didn't always eat enough, with dark hair going a little gray at the temples and a face that had seen weather. He was holding a wrapped parcel in one hand. "I don't want your pity," Eleanor said, because that was the first thing she expected, and she didn't have the patience for it right now. Wasn't going to offer it. He held out the parcel. "Cornmeal and salt pork, and there's coffee in there because it seemed like you might need it." She stared at him. "I bought it," he said. "Not charity, just I was standing in there, and I've been hungry before, and—" He stopped, seemed to think about whether to say more, and decided against it. "There's a fire at the Halversons' old place tonight. 2 miles east, you'd see the chimney smoke from the road. I fixed up the cook stove last week. If you and your boy want a hot meal, you're welcome to it. No strings." Eleanor looked at the parcel. She looked at him. She was trying to read something in his face, a catch, an angle, the thing that would explain why a stranger would do this. And she couldn't find it. He was just standing there in the cold with a wrapped bundle of groceries and no particular expression except a sort of steady patience. "What's your name?" she asked. "Gideon Vale." "Eleanor Ridge." She reached out and took the parcel. It was heavier than she'd expected. "Thank you, Mr. Vale. Just Gideon." He nodded once, not a bow, not an elaborate gesture, just a nod, and walked back toward the livery. Eleanor sat on her horse for a minute in the cold, holding the parcel against her chest, and felt something twist in her stomach that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite fear. It was something uncomfortably close to both. She didn't go to the Halverson place that night. She went home, she cooked supper with the cornmeal and salt pork. She watched Noah eat 2 full bowls and not ask where it came from, and she told herself that accepting the groceries was one thing, but going to a strange man's fire was another, and that she'd been through enough without adding foolishness to the list. She went the next night. She told herself it was for Noah, who needed a hot meal that wasn't something she'd stretched from near nothing, and that was true enough. She told herself it was neighborly, which on the Wyoming frontier was also true. You didn't turn down a fair invitation without good reason. It was rude, and rude got around. She packed Noah into his coat and put him up on the horse in front of her, and rode the 2 miles east in the dark with the stars very bright and the wind lying down, just for once, so the cold wasn't quite so vicious. The Halverson place was a 2-room structure that had been abandoned for 3 years after old Jed Halverson died with no heirs. She could see the chimney smoke from half a mile away, and by the time she tied her horse at the post, she could smell venison cooking. Noah, who'd been quiet the whole ride, sat up straight and sniffed the air like a puppy. "Is that? Seems like it." The door was open a crack. Gideon had heard them coming. He appeared in the doorway before she knocked, looked at Noah with what she'd come to recognize as his default expression, which was a sort of careful neutrality that kept from being unfriendly, and held the door wider. "Come in out of the cold." Inside was sparse but functional. He'd put effort into the space without making it feel like a home. There was a clean table, 2 benches, the repaired cook stove burning well, and a pot over it that smelled like something that had been simmering all day. He'd hung a lantern on a peg by the door. There was very little else. Noah stood in the middle of the room and looked around with the frank inventory of a child. "You live here?" "For now." "There's no furniture." "Boy needs more than a bench and a table?" He said it without heat, just as a question. Noah considered this seriously. "A bed might be good." "I sleep on the floor. It's fine." Eleanor watched Noah absorb this information, watched him decide, with the particular instinct that children have, whether he trusted this person, and saw the moment he came down on the side of tentative yes. He went to the table, sat down on the bench, and folded his hands the way Eleanor had taught him to, and waited. "He's polite," Gideon said to Eleanor, not to Noah. "He's hungry," Eleanor said. "Polite and hungry." She set her coat on a peg. "What can I do to help?" "Nothing. Sit down." "I don't sit while other people cook." He looked at her for a beat. "Then you can cut that bread." She cut the bread. He served the stew, venison with dried onions and something else she couldn't identify, but that tasted, to her road-worn and undernourished palate, like the best thing she'd eaten in months. They ate mostly in silence, which could have been awkward, but wasn't. Noah ate steadily and without speaking, and Gideon refilled his bowl without being asked, and Eleanor watched this and felt the thing in her stomach that she'd been suppressing since yesterday get a little more complicated. "Where'd you come from?" she asked after a while. "Missouri, mostly. Before that, Kansas." He broke off a piece of bread. "I move around." "How long have you been in Burnt Creek?" 3 weeks. "Doing what?" "Odd work. Somebody always needs something fixed." He glanced up. "I'm good with tools." "I can see that." She looked around the room. The cook stove, she realized now, wasn't just repaired. It had been rebuilt in places. The iron plates fitted back together with a care that spoke of someone who knew what they were doing. The Halverson stove was completely ruined when they left it. I heard it had a cracked firebox. It did. Found some scrap iron at the livery, had the blacksmith help me with the casting. He shrugged. "Took a few days." "And you're staying here?" "Seems so. Halverson's nephew in Laramie owns the deed. Have you spoken to him?" "Wrote him a letter. offered 2 months' rent, and to keep the place from falling apart any further. He wrote back and said that was fine. He paused. He's not much interested in the property. She nodded, finished her stew. Beside her, Noah had slowed down enough to look around the room again. At the tools stacked neatly against the wall, at a worn canvas bag in the corner, at Gideon's hands around his own bowl, which were the hands of someone who'd done hard physical work for years. "You fix fences?" Noah asked. Gideon looked at him. "What kind?" "Ours. They're—" He stopped and looked at Eleanor, seemed to reconsider. "Some of them need work." "Noah!" Eleanor kept her voice even. "I'm just saying," the boy said, not whining, just stating a fact. There was a pause. Gideon looked at Eleanor and she saw something in his face. Not the calculation she'd been braced for, not the weighing up of what he might get in return, just a kind of straightforward consideration. "I can take a look," he said. "You don't need to do that," Eleanor said. "I know I don't need to." He picked up his bowl, stood, took it to the wash basin. "I said I'd take a look, that's all." He came 3 days later, at first light, with fence wire and a post-hole digger borrowed from someone in town. Eleanor was at the stove when she heard the horse in the yard and looked out to see him dismounting in the gray morning cold, already scanning the fence line with the focused attention of someone assessing work. She watched through the window for a minute before she put on her coat. "You didn't have to come this early?" she said, stepping outside. "Best time to work." He was already walking the east fence, running a hand along the wire. "Your posts are heaved. Ground froze and thawed too many times. Push them up." He crouched down, examined one at the base. "This whole section will need to come out and be reset, or you'll lose the whole fence come spring thaw." "I know." She crossed her arms against the cold. "I've been meaning to get to it. A lot of things to get to when you're running a place alone." He said it without particular sympathy, just as observation. "Where's the boy?" "Still sleeping." "Let him sleep." He stood, brushed the dirt off his knee. "I'll start on this end. You want to tell me where else is bad?" She showed him. There were 4 sections of fence that needed serious attention, a gate that had dropped off its hinge, and a section of the barn roof that had been patching with boards that were now rotting out. She took him through all of it with the same business-like manner she used for everything, cataloging problems without apology, and he listened and asked practical questions and didn't once say anything that suggested he thought she should have handled it differently or sooner. By the time Noah appeared in the cabin doorway, still half asleep, Gideon was already setting posts. The boy stood in the yard in his coat and watched for a minute. Then he went inside, came back out with his own coat properly buttoned and his hat on, and walked over to where Gideon was working. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. Gideon pointed to the roll of wire. "Keep that from tangling." It was not a small task for an 8-year-old, and Noah took it seriously. Eleanor watched from the porch with her coffee, watched her son concentrate on keeping the wire straight and unkinked while Gideon worked steadily down the fence line, and felt the complicated thing in her stomach get complicated in a new direction. She went inside after a while. There was bread to make, and she needed something to do with her hands. He left at midday. He didn't come in for food. She'd offered, and he'd said he was fine, which she suspected wasn't entirely true, but which she also recognized as the stubbornness of a man who didn't want to push his presence where it might not be wanted. He finished the east fence, left the tools in the barn, and rode out with a simple nod to Eleanor and a 2-finger gesture to Noah that the boy returned solemnly. After he was gone, Noah came and stood beside Eleanor on the porch, and they watched the road for a minute in the way that people do when someone has left. "He's going to come back," Noah said. "Maybe." "He left the wire." Noah pointed to the barn. "He left the rest of the wire, so he's going to come back to finish." Eleanor looked at the barn. She hadn't noticed that. But Noah was right. There was still wire left, which meant there were still sections unfinished, which meant he had a practical reason to return, which was not the same as choosing to return, but was at least something. "That's practical thinking," she said. "Papa always said look at what a man does, not what he says." Noah's voice was steady when he said it. He'd been saying Thomas's name with more ease lately, working through the grief in the way children sometimes did, in fragments and quietly. He didn't say anything. He just came and fixed the fence. "He did," Eleanor agreed. They went back inside. The fire needed tending, there was bread to finish, and the afternoon was already getting short and cold. But Eleanor paused at the window for a moment before going to the stove, looking out at the yard and the repaired fence and the road where Gideon Vale's tracks were already beginning to fill in with the light snow that had started to fall. She didn't know what to make of him. She'd been wrong about people before. She'd thought Thomas was invincible, and the frontier had proved her wrong on that in the cruelest way possible. She'd learned since then not to trust her first impressions, not to believe that goodness in someone meant safety, not to confuse being grateful with being wise. But she thought about the way Noah had watched him work. She thought about the way Gideon had handed him the wire responsibility without condescension, without making it a child's task, just treating it like actual work that needed doing. She thought about the way he'd listened to her catalog of problems without fixing his face into the particular expression that men got when they thought a woman didn't know what she was talking about. She thought, maybe. And then she went to make the bread, because thinking maybe and actually knowing were two different things, and she'd learned the hard way that the space between them was where most of the pain lived. Outside, the snow came down soft and steady over the repaired fence and the bare cottonwoods and the long flat of Wyoming that stretched away in every direction with nothing to stop the wind for 50 miles. And Eleanor Ridge stood in her cold kitchen and kneaded bread dough with her jaw set and her hands working and her mind full of things she didn't quite have words for yet. The winter was not done with them. She knew that. Whatever Gideon Vale was or wasn't, the winter was not done with them. And she had a son to keep warm and a homestead to hold together and not enough of either money or time to afford the luxury of hope. But she measured out the flour carefully, made the loaf as big as she dared, and put it in the oven for 2, just in case. He came back 2 days later, like Noah said he would. No announcement, no knock on the door first. Eleanor looked out the window at 7:30 in the morning, and there was Gideon Vale in her yard, pulling the remaining fence wire off his saddle and setting it against the post like he'd simply continued from where he'd left off. Like 2 days hadn't passed. Like the cold and the distance and the full life she was trying to hold together between his visits were just minor interruptions to a job that was already in progress. She stood at the window for a moment with her coffee and watched him work. Then she went out. "You could knock," she said. He glanced over his shoulder. "Didn't want to wake the boy. He's been up since 6. He turned back to the post. Still, knocking felt like I was asking permission to do something I already said I'd do. Eleanor considered that logic. It was strange, but it wasn't wrong, and she didn't have the energy to argue with things that weren't wrong. She went back inside and made a second cup of coffee and brought it out to him, which he took without comment, and that was the unspoken arrangement established between them from that morning forward. He finished the west fence section by noon. He reset 2 heaved posts on the south side in the afternoon. He found a place where the ground had shifted under the barn's foundation sill and wedged it back level with rocks he pulled from the creek bed, a repair that Eleanor hadn't even identified as a problem yet, but that would have caused serious trouble come spring. He didn't point any of this out as evidence of his usefulness. He just fixed it and moved on to the next thing. Noah followed him through most of it, not in an attached, trailing way, more like a shadow that kept a respectful distance, watching everything with those serious gray eyes, occasionally being handed something to hold or asked to fetch a tool from the barn. Gideon didn't try to entertain him or talk down to him or perform any particular warmth. He just included him in the work as though it was natural, as though an 8-year-old's pair of hands was a practical asset rather than an inconvenience. At one point, Eleanor came out to the barn and found them both crouched over the foundation sill, Gideon pointing at something in the gap, Noah with his face 3 inches from the wood, trying to see what he was seeing. "There," Gideon said. "You see how it's soft there? That's where the rot started. It looks the same to me. Poke it with your finger." Noah poked it. His finger went in slightly. He pulled it back and looked at it. "Oh," he said. "That's bad. It's not good. But it's not gone yet. If you catch it early..." He pulled out his knife, cut out the soft section with practiced strokes. "You cut it out and pack the gap right. It'll hold another few years. You leave it, it spreads. Rot's patient." Noah watched this operation with intense focus. "How do you know all this stuff?" "Spent 10 years fixing things people let go too long." He kept working. "That teaches you what it looks like before it gets bad." "My papa didn't know stuff like this," Noah said. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact he was still making peace with. He was good at other things. Most people are good at some things and not others. What are you not good at? Gideon paused, thought about it with what appeared to be genuine consideration. Staying put, he said finally. Then he went back to packing the gap and didn't elaborate, and Noah, apparently satisfied with the honesty of that answer, didn't push. Eleanor had been standing in the barn doorway the whole time. Neither of them had noticed her. She went back to the house quietly and stood at the stove and told herself not to read too much into a man cutting rot out of a foundation sill. The weeks moved the way weeks do in November on the Wyoming frontier. Fast when you were working, brutally slow when you weren't, and always with the sky pressing down a little lower each day, the cold getting a little more serious about its intentions. Eleanor kept her routines tight. Up before light, stove started. Noah fed, and at his lessons by 8, then the constant rotation of chores that a homestead demanded. Feeding what animals she had left, checking the wood supply, mending things that needed mending, keeping the cabin warm enough that her breath didn't show inside, which some mornings was harder than others. Gideon came 3 or 4 times a week. Sometimes he came every day for a stretch, and then she wouldn't see him for 2 days running, and she told herself both consciously and firmly that the 2 days didn't make her anxious, that she wasn't listening for hoofbeats in the yard, that the absence of him was simply normal because he had no particular obligation to be here. She was not entirely convincing herself. What she couldn't deny was the practical difference. The fences were solid now. The barn roof had been patched properly. He'd pulled the rotting boards, sourced replacement timber from a mill outside of town, and spent 2 days on the roof in near-freezing temperatures, getting the pitch right so it would shed snow. The woodpile, which had been frightening her since September, was now double what it had been, because he'd spent 3 consecutive mornings splitting and stacking while she worked inside. And when she'd come out to say that was enough, more than enough, he'd said, "You want to run short in February?" and kept splitting. She didn't answer that. February was a long way off and also felt like it was coming at her fast. The townspeople had opinions. She knew this because Margaret Tillis stopped by one afternoon under the pretense of returning a borrowed preserving jar, which Eleanor recognized as cover, since Margaret had borrowed that jar in September and it could have waited, and spent 20 minutes in Eleanor's kitchen drinking tea and asking questions that were shaped like friendly conversation but were actually gathering information. "That man I keep seeing at your place," Margaret said, with the careful neutrality of someone who had already formed an opinion. "The drifter. Gideon someone." "Gideon Vale." Eleanor kept her hands busy with the mending. "He's been helping with repairs." Margaret turned her cup. "Where'd you say he came from?" "Missouri, before that Kansas. He moves around. And he's staying at the old Halverson place." "That's right. Alone. As far as I know." Margaret looked at her over the rim of her cup. "Eleanor, I say this as a friend. I know you do. A woman in your situation, a widow, alone, with a young child, people talk. And when a strange man starts coming and going from a widow's property on a regular basis, they talk more." Eleanor set down the shirt she was mending and looked at Margaret directly. "What would you have me do, Margaret? The fence was heaving. The barn roof was letting in weather. I have $11 in the floorboard and no husband, and I cannot do everything myself." She picked the shirt back up. "If people want to talk, they can talk. The fence is fixed." Margaret had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "I'm not saying he's done wrong by you. I'm saying be careful." "I'm always careful." Eleanor bit off a thread. "It's the main thing I am." After Margaret left, Eleanor sat at the table for a moment in the quiet of the cabin and felt the dual irritation of knowing the woman meant well and resenting it anyway. She wasn't naive. She knew what it looked like. She knew what people were saying at the Burnt Creek dry goods store and over fences and at whatever passed for social life in this 7-building collection of ambitions that called itself a town. What she also knew was that her barn roof didn't leak anymore, and her woodpile would last the winter, and her son had been eating 2 full meals a day for 3 weeks. The gossip could have the rest. It was Noah who pushed the friendship forward, the way children often do, without asking permission and without understanding why permission might be necessary. He'd been talking to Gideon one afternoon while they were carrying water from the well, an ongoing task that took multiple trips, and that Noah had appointed himself Gideon's assistant for, and somewhere in that conversation he'd mentioned that he'd been trying to learn to whittle, and that Eleanor had told him he could practice on scrapwood, but that she couldn't show him how because she'd never learned herself. 3 days later, Gideon arrived with 2 small knives and a canvas wrap and a bag of dry pine scraps. Eleanor saw him set them on the table and felt something between warmth and resistance move through her. "You didn't have to do that." Boy said he wanted to learn. He unrolled the canvas. "These are proper carving knives, not kitchen knives. Safer, if you use them right. Sharper, actually, which is counterintuitive." "Sharper is safer?" "Dull blade slips. Sharp blade does what you tell it." He looked at her. "That's true of most things." Noah was already at the table with his hands 6 inches from the knives, not touching them, waiting. "May I?" he asked, which he'd clearly been coached at some point to ask before touching other people's tools. Gideon sat down across from him. "You may. But first," he held up his own hands, "you always curl your fingers like this when you're cutting toward yourself. If the knife slips, it goes past your knuckles, not into them. Show me you can do that before you pick it up." Noah curled his fingers. Gideon examined the position with the seriousness of someone who'd probably cut himself enough times to respect the instruction. "Good. Now pick up the knife." Eleanor watched them for a while. Watched Gideon correct Noah's grip twice without irritation. Watched Noah focus on the wood scrap with his tongue between his teeth. Watched the first rough curl of pine fall to the table and Noah look up with an expression of pure satisfaction. And then she went to start supper because she needed something to do that wasn't standing in the middle of her own kitchen, feeling things she hadn't given herself permission to feel. She made more food than she needed to that night. She didn't overthink it. Boss. The cold deepened through the end of November in the particular way that Wyoming cold did. Not all at once, but in increments, each one permanent, like the temperature was making a series of decisions it wasn't going to revisit. Eleanor woke some mornings to find ice on the inside of the windows and the fire burned down to coals, and she'd lie still for just a moment under the quilts before the discipline of necessity got her moving, because there was no margin in this life for self-pity, not even the small private kind. One morning she came outside to find Gideon already in the yard, and this time he wasn't working on the fences or the barn. He was standing at the woodpile with his head slightly tilted, looking at the cabin itself. "What?" she said. "Your north wall," he pointed. "You see where the chinking's gone there between the logs? Second row up, there." She looked. She could see the gap now that he was pointing at it. "That's been leaking cold air all season. That's why you can't keep the northwest corner of the main room warm." She stared at the gap. She'd noticed the cold corner, had moved the furniture away from it, had assumed it was just the way the cabin was built. She hadn't thought to look at the outside wall. "I thought, it's an easy fix. I can have it rechunked today if you've got clay or a mix I can use." He paused. "Do you have anything like that?" "There's some old mortar mix in the barn. Thomas used it on the chimney last year. That'll work." She helped him that morning, which was not something she'd done before. Usually she stayed out of his way and let him work, which felt like the right division of their arrangement. But the rechinking required someone to hold the tools and pass materials while he worked the higher sections, and Noah was at his lessons. And it turned out that working beside Gideon Vale at a practical task was surprisingly comfortable. He didn't feel the need to fill silence. This was, she had learned, one of his most useful qualities. Most men she'd known, Thomas included, and she'd loved Thomas genuinely, had a tendency to narrate their own work, to explain what they were doing and why, to fill air with the sound of their own competence. Gideon worked quietly and expected the same. If he needed something, he said so. Otherwise, nothing. After about an hour, while she was handing him material and watching his hands work it into the gap, she said, "Why do you keep coming here?" He didn't answer right away. She'd learned that meant he was thinking about it rather than being evasive. "What do you mean?" he said finally. "I mean, you've done more work on this property in 6 weeks than some hired men would do in a season. I haven't paid you, and I can't pay you, and I've been clear about that. So I'm asking." She kept her voice level. "Why?" He pressed a section of mortar mix smooth. "Does there have to be a reason?" "In my experience, there's always a reason." "Your experience is probably right." He moved slightly along the wall. "But sometimes the reason is just a thing is needed and you can do it, so you do." He glanced at her. "Are you asking because you're suspicious of me, or because you feel like you owe me something? She thought about it. Both, she said. Probably more the second. You don't owe me anything. I know I don't think I do, but you've been here most days for 6 weeks, and that creates a feeling of obligation. Yes, he nodded slowly. I understand that. He worked in silence for a moment. I'm not here to put you in debt to me, Eleanor. That's not my interest. If it ever feels that way, you tell me and I'll stop. She believed him. She was not sure she entirely trusted her own ability to tell the difference between a man who was honest and a man who was good at sounding honest, but she believed this specific statement at this specific moment, which was all she could do. All right, she said. All right, he said, and went back to work. The harder thing, the thing she didn't say out loud to Gideon or to Margaret Tillis or to anyone, was what she saw happening with Noah. The boy had been trying so hard since Thomas died, trying to be quiet enough, to be undemanding enough, to not add his weight to hers. She'd watched him do it for 14 months, and it had broken something small and private in her each time. The sight of an 8-year-old deciding that his grief was inconvenient. She'd tried to talk to him about it and gotten the patient, careful responses of a child who'd decided that being easy to manage was how he could help. She'd tried to let him see that she was sad too, that it was allowed, and he'd hold her hand and nod, and then go back to being careful. With Gideon, he was different. Not transformed. This wasn't a story where a stranger appeared and fixed everything, but loosened somehow. Less careful. He asked questions without first checking whether the questions were annoying. He made mistakes in front of him, cut the wrong way, split the wood crooked, held the fence post at an angle that required resetting. And Gideon corrected him without any drama, and Noah didn't flinch, just fixed it and tried again. He was learning that making a mistake wasn't the same as being a problem. One evening, she overheard them in the barn while she was crossing the yard. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the voices carried. Do you think she worries all the time? Noah was asking. Mama, I mean. Yes, Gideon said without hesitation. Is that going to stop? A pause. Probably not entirely, but I think it gets lighter. How do you know? I've worried about things. Some of them stopped mattering. Some of them got fixed. Another pause. Some of them I'm still carrying, but you learned to carry it different. Not so heavy in the chest. Silence. Do you worry? Noah asked. Sure. About what? About doing wrong by people who trust me. A beat. About not being enough for a thing that needs more than I've got. He sounded like he was choosing words carefully, not because he was hiding something, but because he was trying to be precise. About running when I should stay. Eleanor stood in the yard in the dark and cold and didn't move for a moment. Then she walked back to the cabin quietly, went inside, and stood at the stove with her hands around a cup she'd forgotten to fill. She didn't know what Gideon Vale was to her. She couldn't name it and didn't try. What she knew was that he was careful with her son in ways she hadn't known to ask for, and that he fixed things without making her feel like they needed fixing, and that when he said he wasn't trying to put her in debt to him, she believed him. That was not nothing. Out here in this winter, on this stretch of Wyoming that didn't care about any of them even a little. That was further from nothing than she'd been in a long time. She was still afraid of it. She was a practical woman, and she knew what happened to things you let yourself count on. But the fear was getting less loud than it used to be, and she wasn't sure if that was wisdom or foolishness. And she was too tired and too cold and too full of something she didn't have a word for yet to work out the difference. Outside, the wind had picked up again off the flats. The temperature was dropping toward something serious. In the barn, she could hear Noah's voice, a question she couldn't make out. And then Gideon's lower answer, and then Noah's short laugh, which was a sound Eleanor hadn't heard enough of in 14 months, and which stopped her where she stood. She stood and listened to it until it ended, and then she made herself move, because standing in your own kitchen being grateful for the sound of your child laughing was fine for a moment, but she had supper to make and wood to bring in, and tomorrow was already coming whether she was ready or not. She was getting closer to ready. That was the best she could honestly say. For now, it was enough. The snow started on a Thursday. Eleanor had felt it coming for 2 days. That particular heaviness in the air, the way the animals got restless and the sky went the color of old pewter and stayed that way without changing. She'd spent Wednesday moving extra wood onto the porch, pulling the remaining feed closer to the barn door, filling every container she had with water from the well before the pump could freeze. She'd done all of this with the efficiency of someone who'd survived Wyoming winters before, but also with the particular knot in her stomach of someone who knew that preparation and outcome were two different things. Gideon had come by Wednesday afternoon and helped her move the last of the wood. He'd looked at the sky the same way she had and said, "This is going to be more than a day." And she'd said, "I know." And they'd worked faster after that. He'd gone back to the Halverson place that evening. She'd watched him ride out and thought about saying something, about the roads, about the distance, about the fact that if the storm came in hard and fast, a 2-mile ride could turn into something serious. But she hadn't said it, because saying it would have meant something she wasn't ready to mean, and he hadn't offered to stay, which she told herself was the right and appropriate thing. By Thursday morning, the wind had found its purpose, and the snow was coming sideways off the flats, the kind that didn't fall so much as a tack. Eleanor got Noah up early, got the fire fed to something serious, and settled in for the waiting that was the other half of frontier survival. The part nobody talked about, where you'd done everything you could do and all that was left was enduring. She was at the stove at 8:30 when she heard the knock. Not a timid knock. 3 solid raps, the kind of knock that meant the person on the other side had been in the wind long enough to have lost patience with subtlety. She opened the door and Gideon came in on a gust of snow, his coat white with it, his hat brim sagging under the weight, his face red from cold. "You rode here in this?" she said. "Road's not closed yet." He pulled his hat off and knocked the snow off it against his leg. "Won't be long, though. Another few hours and you won't be able to see the hand in front of your face." "Then why didn't you stay at your place?" He looked at her steadily. "Because your place has a better stove and a leaky north wall I just rechunked, and I wanted to see if it held." A beat. "And because you're alone out here." She should have said something practical to that. Something about how she'd been alone all fall and managed fine. Something about how she didn't need watching over. She looked at his red face and the snow melting off his coat onto her floor and thought about the 2-mile road in a whiteout and said, "Hang your coat by the stove." He did. Noah came out of the back room with the alert expression of a child who'd heard the knock and had been waiting to see who it was. He saw Gideon, looked at the snow-plastered coat on the peg, looked at Eleanor, and read the situation with the accuracy he'd been developing for months. "Is he staying?" Noah asked. "For now," Eleanor said. "Good." Noah pulled out the bench at the table and sat down like a minor logistics problem had just been resolved. "I didn't want to do lessons today anyway." "You're still doing lessons," Eleanor said. "With him here?" "With him here." Noah looked at Gideon with an expression that held the faint hope of an ally. Gideon sat down across from him and said, "Do your lessons. I'll be here when you're done." By noon, the storm had made its full intentions known. The wind was a constant low roar, not the dramatic gusting kind, but the sustained grinding kind that was harder to listen to over hours, the kind that found every gap and breathed cold through it. The north wall held. Eleanor checked it twice and felt both times only normal cabin cold, not the cutting draft that had lived in that corner all fall. She didn't say anything to Gideon about it. She thought he noticed her checking. The 3 of them ate lunch together, which had started happening with enough regularity that it no longer felt strange. Eleanor made a thin soup with dried beans and the last of the salt pork, stretching it with more water than she would have preferred, but making up for it with the bread she'd made that morning. Gideon ate what was put in front of him without comment, which she'd long since identified as one of his better qualities. "You're going to be here tonight," Noah announced midway through the meal. "Not a question." "Looks that way," Gideon said. "Where will you sleep?" "Noah," Eleanor said. "It's a fair question," Gideon said. "Floor's fine. I've slept on worse." "The floor is cold," Noah said. "You could have my room." "I'm not taking your room." "I could sleep out here by the fire. I've done it before." "Then I'll sleep out here by the fire." He said it with the kind of absolute practicality that ended negotiations without making them into arguments. Problem solved. Noah seemed to accept this, then thought of something. "What if the fire goes out? I'll wake up." "What if you don't?" "Noah." Eleanor said it with enough weight that he recognized the conversation was over. He went back to his soup. Gideon caught Eleanor's eye across the table, and there was something in his face, not quite amusement, but close to it, and she looked away before she could let herself smile. The afternoon passed in the strange, compressed way that bad weather creates. Time moved differently when the world outside had reduced itself to white noise and white visibility, when there was nowhere to go and no work that could be done outside. Eleanor mended. Noah did a combination of lessons and whittling, producing a small, misshapen object that he insisted was a horse and that Gideon assessed with a straight face and said looked like a horse that had had a hard life. Noah found this funnier than Eleanor expected and laughed the short, real laugh she'd heard in the barn 2 weeks ago. Gideon spent part of the afternoon looking at Eleanor's window frames, the interior side examining where the cold seeped in, and made a quiet mental inventory she could tell he was doing even though he said nothing. He had a habit of cataloging problems silently, noting things, filing them somewhere. It used to make her uneasy. Now she recognized it as the way he moved through a space he'd taken responsibility for. She wasn't sure exactly when she'd started thinking of him that way, as someone who'd taken responsibility for something here, rather than someone doing occasional favors. It had happened gradually enough that she couldn't mark the moment. But it was true, and she knew it. Darkness came early, before 5, the way it did in December. Eleanor lit the lanterns, made supper from what she had, cornmeal mush with dried apples stirred through, not much but hot, and the 3 of them ate by lamplight with the storm pressing against the walls like something trying to get in. Noah fell asleep in his chair before the meal was fully cleared. He'd been fighting it for an hour, his head drooping and jerking back up, and finally lost the fight between one moment and the next. Eleanor got him to his bed in the back room without fully waking him, pulled the quilt up, and came back to find Gideon feeding the fire with the quiet efficiency he brought to all physical tasks. She sat at the table. He sat on the floor near the stove, his back against the wall, his knees drawn up. They'd been together in this small space for 12 hours at that point. She expected the silence to be heavy by now, but it wasn't. "The north wall held," she said. "I know. How do you know?" "You checked it twice, and you didn't say anything about it." He looked at the stove. "If it hadn't held, you'd have said something." She turned her cup in her hands. "That's observant. I pay attention." Outside, the wind hit the cabin in a long, sustained push that made the walls creak. Both of them looked at the ceiling for a second, involuntarily, the way you do when a structure speaks, and then looked back. "The roof'll hold," he said. "I went over every board." "I know." She paused. "I'm not worried about the roof." He waited. With Gideon, silence was a genuine invitation. He never rushed a conversation, never filled the space before the other person was ready. And she'd learned that about him the way you learn things about people when you stop expecting them to be who you've met before. "I'm worried about February," she said. "I'm worried about January, actually. I've got enough food to get through if I'm careful, but careful means Noah eats enough and I don't always. And that's fine, that's what mothers do, but there's a point where not eating enough starts to affect what I can do, and what I can do is the whole thing. The whole thing depends on what I can do." She stopped, set her cup down. "I don't usually say that out loud." "I know. It's not—" She shook her head. "I'm not telling you so you'll fix it. I'm just—" She looked at him. "I'm tired of pretending everything is more manageable than it is." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've got money. Not a lot, but enough for provisions through March. I won't take your money. I know you won't. I wasn't offering it as charity." He paused. "I was offering it as a person who's been around long enough to know that pride in winter is a liability." "Don't tell me about pride," she said, and it came out sharper than she intended. "I'm not." His voice was even. "I'm telling you that I have it, and you're allowed to not have enough. And both those things can be true at the same time without it meaning something about your worth." Eleanor looked at him across the small space of the cabin, in the lamplight, with the storm outside making its long, persistent case against the walls. 14 months she'd been holding everything herself. 14 months of making the numbers work, and the food stretch, and the boy feel safe, and the grief stay manageable. All of it, every single day, and nobody had said to her in all that time, directly, without softening it, that she was allowed to not have enough. "I don't know how to not be the one managing everything," she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said to another person in over a year. "I know." He turned his cup between his hands, a habit she'd noticed he shared with her. I'm not asking you to stop, I'm just... He stopped, seemed to reframe. You've been carrying this alone because that's what was available. That's the only reason. Not because you have to. Not because that's what the situation requires permanently. She looked at him for a long time. What are you saying? I'm saying I don't want to leave here. He said it plainly, without building up to it, without dramatizing it. Not because I feel obligated. Not because there's work to do. He met her eyes. I want to stay, and I can say that plainly, or I can keep showing up with fence wire and pretend there's no other reason, but I'm too old for that kind of pretending. The fire popped. Outside, the storm found a new frequency, and the cabin shook very slightly, just once, like a person startled awake. Eleanor breathed. I lost my husband 14 months ago, she said, and before I'd even finished figuring out what that meant, the whole weight of this place fell on me. And I've been so... She pressed her lips together. I've been so scared of building something and losing it again. I don't know if I have the... She stopped. I don't know if I'm the same person I was before Thomas died. I don't know if she's still here. She is, Gideon said quietly. She came into Harlan's store and asked for what she needed, and when he said no, she set the basket down and walked out without crying in front of him. She's here. Eleanor looked at him. You watched that. Hard not to watch. And you decided... I decided a woman like that was worth offering cornmeal to. He almost smiled. Not quite. The rest I learned after. She was quiet for a long moment. The lamp flickered in a draft from somewhere, steadied itself. What happened to you? She asked. Before Wyoming, you said to Noah you'd been running. He looked at the stove. A long pause. Not evasive, but considered. The kind of pause that meant he was deciding how honest to be and settling on more honest than comfortable. I had a place once, in Missouri. Piece of land, a good house, built most of it myself. I was going to... He stopped. I was going to get married. Woman named Clara. We'd been... It was serious. 2 years serious. He turned the cup. She left. Not... There wasn't a dramatic reason. She just decided I wasn't enough for the life she wanted, and she told me plainly, and she left. And the house and the land I'd built for a future that wasn't going to happen anymore, I couldn't... He shook his head. I couldn't be in it. So I left. How long ago? 4 years. And you've been moving since. And I've been moving since. He looked up. I told myself it was practical, that I had skills people needed and I was doing useful work, which was true. But it was also, he seemed to search for the word. Running, like I told Noah. And now, he looked at her steadily. Now I'm tired of running. And I'm here, and this is the first place in 4 years that's felt like, he paused, like I wanted to come back to it the next day. The fire burned. The storm pushed at the cabin walls with its cold, indifferent weight. Eleanor looked at Gideon Vale. This lean, quiet, careful man who'd fixed her fences and taught her son to whittle and slept on floors and never once made her feel like his help was a debt she was accumulating, and felt the fear in her chest do something she hadn't expected. Not disappear, not lift entirely, but shift, the way Gideon had told Noah grief would shift. Not so heavy in the chest. I can't promise you anything, she said. I can't promise you I won't be afraid. I can't promise this place won't grind you down by March. I know. And Noah is not a complication, he said, with a quiet firmness that landed somewhere important. He's part of it. That's just what's true. She nodded slowly, looked at her hands. You can stay through the storm, she said, and we'll see. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise. It was exactly what it was. A woman who'd been burned by certainty offering the only thing she actually had, today, and the possibility of tomorrow. Gideon Vale looked at her and nodded once. That's enough, he said. And from the way he said it, she believed he meant it. Outside, the storm kept on. It would keep on through the night and into the next day. 2 days total before the wind dropped and the snow settled and the world came back into visibility. The roads would be impassable for another 2 days after that. They sat by the fire in the silence that wasn't uncomfortable anymore. 2 people with damage they'd finally said out loud, and the cabin held around them. The rechunked north wall tight against the cold, the roof solid, the fire sufficient, held the way things hold when they've been properly tended. Not perfectly, but well enough. That night, Eleanor slept better than she had in 14 months. She didn't examine why. She just pulled the quilt up and let the sound of the storm go from threatening to something closer to ordinary, and thought about nothing in particular, and slept. The roads opened on the fourth day. Eleanor knew because she heard a wagon pass on the main track half a mile south, the first sound of wheels in days, and the return of that ordinary noise felt like the world remembering itself. The storm had left 2 feet of snow on the flat and more in the drifts, and the cold that followed it was the brittle, clarified kind that came after big weather. Everything frozen hard and still and so bright under the open sky that it hurt to look at. Gideon dug the barn door clear that morning, then the path from the cabin to the well, then the well itself, which had a drift packed against the cover. He did it in order, efficiently, without being asked, and Eleanor watched through the window and thought about what he'd said 2 nights ago. I don't want to leave here. And thought about her own answer, which had been cautious and noncommittal, and had meant more than it said. He came in for coffee afterward, red-faced and stamping snow off his boots, and set his hat on the peg without any particular ceremony, and sat at the table like a man who knew where he was in a room. Noah, who'd been waiting for the barn to be cleared so he could check on the animals, pulled his coat on and went outside without being told. This was new, the understanding that Gideon's tasks created space for his own, that the 3 of them had started operating with a kind of loose, unspoken coordination. You should go back to the Halverson place, Eleanor said. She'd been thinking about how to say it for an hour. Check on the pipes, the stove, make sure nothing froze. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. I'll go this afternoon. Not to stay, just to check. She said it before she could stop herself, and then heard herself say it and looked at her cup. Gideon was quiet for a moment. All right. She stopped. She was not a woman who liked walking back her own words. I said what I meant. I know you did. He wasn't smiling, but there was something in his voice, not quite warmth, but close to it, the same close to as always. I'll check on the pipes and come back. She nodded and went to the stove and found something to do there, and that was how it was settled. He came back by supper time. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He moved his tools from the Halverson place on a Tuesday. Not his personal belongings, just the tools, bringing them in on the back of his horse in a tied bundle, and putting them in Eleanor's barn where they'd been living anyway for the past month. She watched him do it from the porch and didn't say anything. He didn't explain. Some things, she'd learned, didn't need explaining if both people already understood them. The Halverson place he kept. He slept there, kept his few belongings there, maintained the respectability of distance that mattered on the Wyoming frontier, where people's perceptions affected things like credit and relationships and the small political ecosystem of a 7-building town. Eleanor didn't ask him to change this arrangement. She understood it was protective of her reputation, of the thing they were building that didn't have a name yet and didn't need one. What changed was the rhythm. He was at the homestead most of the day now, working through the list of things the storm had revealed. A section of the east fence that had buckled under snow weight, a corner post on the barn that had torqued and needed resetting, ice damming on the cabin roof where one section sat at a slightly wrong angle and caught melt. He worked steadily through the cold January days, and Eleanor worked alongside or around him depending on what needed doing. And Noah was at the center of everything in the way that children are when adults stop treating their presence as a complication. Noah had started testing Gideon in the way boys test men they're beginning to trust. Not with bad behavior, but with the harder questions, the ones that required a real answer rather than a comfortable one. Did you ever want kids? He asked one afternoon out of nowhere while they were hauling water. Gideon set his bucket down, picked it back up. Yeah. What happened? Things didn't work out the way I expected. That's what Mama says when she doesn't want to explain something. A beat. Fair. He walked a few steps. The woman I was going to marry didn't want what I had to offer, so I didn't have a family. He kept his voice level, just stating it. And then I was moving around, and you can't have a family if you don't stay somewhere. But you're staying now. I'm staying now. Noah was quiet for a moment, thinking it through with the methodical seriousness that was very Thomas's, but also very much his own. "So do you want them now, kids?" Gideon glanced at him sideways. "I'm carrying water with one right now." Noah absorbed this, looked at the bucket in his own hand, looked at Gideon. "That's not the same." "It's not different as you might think." Eleanor was at the pump. She was looking the other direction, and she kept looking the other direction because she knew if she turned around, the look on her face would be something she wasn't ready to explain. January was hard, in the way January always was. Relentless, cold, each day requiring the same work as the last, with no break in the routine and no warmth from the sky to make it easier. Eleanor got sick for a week midway through the month, a chest cold that she tried to manage through sheer stubbornness, and that refused to be managed. She was angry about it with the particular anger of someone who couldn't afford to be sick, and she pushed through 2 days of it before Gideon came in the morning, looked at her face and said, "Sit down. I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're gray, and you've got a fever, and you're going to make it worse if you spend the day hauling water." "The water has to be hauled." "I'll haul the water." He said it without irritation, just as fact. "Sit down." She sat down, which was how sick she actually was. That she sat down on the first instruction rather than the third. He brought her water, built the fire higher than she'd have built it for herself, told Noah to let her rest when he came in from the morning chores, and went and hauled the water himself. He made a thin broth from the stock she kept on the back of the stove and brought it to the table without fanfare, and she ate it without arguing, which she also would not have done if she'd been at full capacity. On the third day, she was sitting up and feeling better, and she said, "I don't like being taken care of." "I know," he said. He was mending a harness strap at the table. "You've mentioned it. I just want you to know it's not ingratitude. I'm grateful. You've been the one doing the taking care for a long time," he said, without looking up from the strap. "It feels wrong the other direction." She looked at him. "Yes, that's exactly it. It doesn't have to feel right straight away." He worked a stitch through the leather. "You just have to let it happen enough times that it stops feeling so foreign." She was quiet for a moment. "You're more patient than I expected." He looked up. "What did you expect?" She thought about it honestly. "I don't know. Something that wanted more from me than you seem to want." He put the harness down. "What do you think I want, Eleanor?" She met his eyes. "I think you want to stay. And I think you want—" She stopped, tried again. "I think you want to matter here. Not be useful. Matter." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Yeah," he said. "That's right." "You do," she said. She said it plainly, without decoration, because she was sick and tired and past the point of managing how things sounded. "You matter here. I want you to know that." He picked the harness back up, but she could see in the set of his jaw that he'd heard her, that it had landed where she'd meant it. "Get some more rest," he said. She went and got more rest. It was the most willingly she'd done that in 15 months. By the time February arrived, the homestead had changed in ways that were visible, but hard to articulate if you were living inside them. From the outside, Eleanor imagined, it would have been obvious. The repaired fences, the solid barn, the woodpile that had never once gotten to a worrying level because Gideon maintained it like a man who understood what running out meant. The cabin that no longer had a cold corner. The well that had a proper new cover he'd built from a scrap of lumber so water stopped collecting in the mechanism. But from the inside, the change was something else. It was in the way the days were organized, the way work was shared without discussion, the way supper happened at a time that made sense for 3 people instead of 2. It was in Noah, who'd grown in some indefinable way, still careful, still watchful, but less braced, less waiting for the next thing to go wrong. And it was in her. Eleanor could feel it and didn't entirely trust it, which was honest and also unavoidable. She was less alone in the specific way that mattered. Not in company, because she'd had Margaret Tillis and the occasional neighbor and a whole town of people who knew her name, but in the way of having someone who knew the actual situation, who knew about the $11 and the rationed cornmeal and the nights when she'd stood at the window and tried to figure the math of survival one more time. Someone who'd seen her at her most practical and her most afraid and hadn't found either one disqualifying. She still had moments of resistance. Sharp, involuntary moments where she'd catch herself counting on him, expecting the sound of his horse in the yard, planning the day around his presence, and feel a cold snap of fear, the same fear from the storm night, the same knowledge of what it felt like to build a future and have it disappear. She didn't hide these moments from herself. She just tried to sit with them long enough to see them clearly before she acted on them. One afternoon in early February, she came out to the barn and found Gideon sitting on the ground with his back against the wall, just sitting, not doing anything. He had the look of a man who'd been thinking hard about something and had hit a wall. "What's wrong?" she asked. He looked up, seemed to consider whether to say it. "Nothing's wrong. You're sitting on a frozen barn floor in February staring at nothing. Something's wrong." He exhaled. "I got a letter." She went still. "From who?" "Man named Caleb Stearns. He's a rancher up in Billings. Knew me from Kansas. Heard I was in the territory." He turned the letter over in his hands. She could see it now, folded and refolded. "He's offering me work. Good work. Foreman on his operation, good wage, housing." Eleanor looked at him. The cold in the barn was the regular kind, but it felt sharper than usual. "When does he need an answer? He'd want me by March." She stood with her arms crossed, not out of defensiveness, but because the barn was cold. "What are you going to tell him?" He looked at her directly. "What do you want me to tell him?" "Don't do that," she said, and her voice came out firmer than she intended. "Don't make it my answer. You have to decide what you want." "I know what I want." He got up from the floor, dusted the hay off his coat. "I want to know what this is. Between us. Because if it's..." He stopped. "If it's nothing, or if it's not going to become something, then Stearns' offer is a good offer and I should take it. And I need you to be straight with me, Eleanor. I can take the truth better than I can take being managed." She looked at him. This man who'd been here since October, who'd shown up in the snow without being asked and fixed the north wall, and taught her son to whittle and carried her water when she was sick, and never once made her feel like a charity case or a burden or a woman who needed managing. She thought about the fear, the real fear, the one that lived in her chest and said, "What if you build it and lose it again?" And she thought, "What if you don't build it because you're afraid and you lose it anyway?" "I don't know what I can promise you," she said. "I'm not in a place where promises come easy. I'm not asking for promises." "I know," she breathed. "I'm asking you not to go to Billings." He was still. "Not because I'm certain," she said. "Not because I've figured out how this ends or what it means or whether I'm..." She pressed her mouth together. "Because I want you here. And I'm tired of pretending that's not true because it scares me. And that's all I've got right now. That's the honest version." Gideon stood in the barn in the cold and looked at her for a long moment. Then he folded the letter in half again, tucked it into his coat pocket and said, "All right." "All right, meaning what?" "Meaning I'll write Stearns and tell him I've got obligations." He moved past her toward the barn door. "And meaning, thank you for saying the honest version." She stood in the barn after he went out, listening to his boots in the snow, and felt something that was not quite relief and not quite joy, but was something in the neighborhood of both. Something that felt, in its small and cautious way, like the beginning of a decision. The rest of February she would remember not as easy. It wasn't easy. Nothing about that winter was easy. But as different. As a month where the difficulty had company. Noah noticed the difference, which meant it was visible enough to be real. He didn't say anything about it directly, but he started setting 3 places at the table in the morning before he was even asked, which was its own kind of announcement. He went to bed less carefully, less like he was trying not to take up space, and more like a boy who thought he was allowed to be tired. One evening he fell asleep on the floor in front of the fire with his whittling in his hand, a small figure that had started as a horse and was now being optimistically reclassified as a dog, and Gideon picked him up and carried him to the back room and put him in bed with the ease of someone doing a familiar thing, and came back out and sat across from Eleanor at the table. She poured him coffee. He took it. "He trusts you," she said. "I know." He held the cup. "I don't take that lightly." "I know you don't. That's why I said it." He looked at her across the table. "I'm not going anywhere, Eleanor." "You said that once before, about running." "I know I said it. I'm saying it again." He set the cup down. I'm saying it as many times as it takes for it to feel true to you, because you've had enough things said and not meant. This one, I mean. She looked at her hands. You're going to get tired of saying it. I haven't gotten tired of fixing the fence. She almost smiled. Not quite, but close. The fence doesn't require faith. No, he said. It just requires showing up. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight, in the warmth of a cabin they'd both worked to make livable, with her son asleep in the next room in the cold Wyoming night pressing gently against the walls. She thought about the morning in October when she'd walked out of Harlan's general store with her hands shaking and stood in the cold, not crying through pure force of will. She thought about how far that morning felt, and how it didn't feel like another life, exactly. More like the same life, just carrying less alone. All right, she said. The word she'd heard him use, his version of enough, said, problem settled. She'd meant it the same way. He understood. He picked up his coffee cup and finished it and looked at the fire, and neither of them needed to say anything else. The winter still had weeks left in it. There would still be cold mornings and thin meals and days where everything that could go wrong tried to. That was Wyoming in 1883, and it wasn't going to change on account of anyone's feelings. But in the cabin on the Ridge homestead, the fire was burning right. The walls were solid, and 3 people were sleeping through the night without the particular kind of fear that comes from facing everything alone. It wasn't perfect, not even close, but it was real, and it held, and on the frontier, real and holding was about the best you could ask for. March came in mean, the way it usually did in Wyoming, not with the softness that people in gentler places associated with the beginning of spring, but with a kind of aggressive indecision, warm enough one day to make you think the worst was over, and then cold enough the next to remind you that the land made its own schedule and didn't care about yours. The creek flooded its low bank twice in the first 2 weeks from snowmelt, and then froze back over at night, and the mud that came with the thaw was the deep, sucking kind that pulled at boot heels and made every trip between the cabin and the barn twice the work it should have been. Gideon spent those weeks shoring up the low section of fencing near the creek before the water could take it out. It was miserable work. Cold water over the boots, ground that wouldn't hold a post right because the frost was coming out of it in uneven patches. And Eleanor brought coffee out twice a day and didn't tell him to stop, or that it could wait, because she understood by now that he worked through problems the way she did, forward and without pausing, and that telling him to stop would have been about her discomfort with watching someone work hard on her behalf, not about what actually needed doing. Noah helped where he could. He was 9 now. His birthday had fallen on a Tuesday in late February, and Eleanor had made a cake from the last of the sugar with a seriousness of purpose that Gideon had watched from across the kitchen with the expression he got when something mattered to him, and he was keeping it off his face. They'd sat at the table and eaten it, all 3 of them, and Gideon had given Noah a proper folding knife with a bone handle, the kind a working man carried, and said, "You're old enough for a real one now." And Noah had held it like it weighed more than it did, which it did, in the way that gifts carry the weight of what they mean. "You didn't have to do that," Eleanor had said after Noah was in bed. "I know." He'd cleared the plates. "He's a good boy. He deserved something real." She'd stood in the kitchen and thought about Thomas, who had loved Noah completely, but who had never quite figured out how to talk to him man to man, who'd been better at affection than instruction. She'd thought about the fact that she was thinking about Thomas without the usual sharp-edged grief, and that had felt significant. Not like moving on exactly, but like the grief had finally found its right shape, the one you could live around. By April, the homestead looked different, not unrecognizably so. It was still the same land, the same cabin, the same creek running past the east fence, but the things that had been failing were no longer failing. The barn was solid. The fences ran straight and tight. The cabin windows had been reglazed where the old putty had dried and cracked, and the north wall that had once been the coldest place in the house now held heat like it was supposed to. Gideon had started on a small addition off the back of the barn. A proper tack room, he said, which they needed, and Eleanor didn't argue because they did need it, and also because watching him work with wood had become one of the more quietly satisfying things about her days. The way he measured twice and cut once and fit things together with the patience of a man who'd learned that rushing ruined more work than it saved. The cow had come back into milk in late March, which was later than Eleanor had hoped, but better than she'd feared. The 2 remaining chickens had been joined by 4 more that she'd traded a day's labor for with a family 3 miles up the creek. She'd helped them with a calving that had gone sideways, stayed most of the night, come home exhausted and satisfied, and with 4 young hens in a crate on her saddle. Gideon had been in the yard when she rode in at dawn, looking at the crate with an expression that was as close to surprised as she ever saw him get. "You were out all night," he said, "calving trouble at the Mercer place." She handed him the crate. "Put these in the barn. Separate them from the others for a few days until they settle." He took the crate and looked at her. The exhaustion in her face, the mud on her coat, the fact that she was already calculating what needed doing before she'd even gotten off the horse. "Go inside," he said. "I'll do the morning chores. I can—" Eleanor. Just her name, even and quiet. "Go inside." She went inside. She sat at the table and drank the coffee he'd left warming on the back of the stove, and felt the particular tiredness that was the good kind, the kind that came from having done something hard and necessary, from having stayed when things got difficult and seen them through. She thought, this is what the frontier actually is. Not the version in anyone's imagination, not hardship as nobility, not struggle as character-building exercise, just this. You need a thing, you find a way to get it, and you rest when you're allowed and get up when you're not. She'd stopped apologizing for needing rest. That had been a harder habit to break than she'd expected. It was in April, on a Tuesday, that she went back to Harlan's. Not because she had to. She had enough now, or close enough that she could manage, but because she needed nails in a specific size for the tack room wall, and Gideon had asked her to pick them up if she was in town. She almost sent Noah, but decided she'd go herself, and she rode in on a morning that had actual warmth in it, the first real warmth since October, with the sun doing something useful for once, and the mud on the main track dried to something you could walk on without losing a boot. Harlan was behind his counter. He looked up when she came in. His expression did the thing it sometimes did with people who knew they'd behaved poorly, a careful rearrangement toward neutral, a pretense of nothing in particular. "Mrs. Ridge," the careful pleasantness. "What can I do for you? 20-penny nails, 4-inch, 2 pounds. She kept her voice even. "Business transaction, nothing more. And I'll take a pound of coffee while I'm here." He got the things, wrote them down. I'll pay now." She set the coins on the counter. Exact amount. She'd calculated it before she came in. She watched him count it and register that it was correct, and she picked up her parcel without waiting to see if there was anything else he wanted to say. She was almost at the door when he said, "I hear you've got that place looking good now, the Ridge Homestead." She stopped, turned halfway. "It's coming along. Got some help, I understand. That man, Vale, is it?" "Gideon Vale." She kept her voice level. "My partner." She hadn't used the word before. It came out with more certainty than she'd expected, which meant it was true. Harlan nodded slowly, with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "Well," he said. "Good to hear." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. This man who'd said, "I don't extend credit to women who can't pay in front of a room full of people while her son was going hungry," and she felt something that wasn't quite forgiveness and wasn't quite contempt, but was somewhere between the two. The place you get to when you realize that someone's cruelty was more about their own smallness than about anything true they saw in you. "I'm sure it is," she said, and walked out. She rode home with the nails and the coffee and the feeling of something laid down, like setting a weight on the ground after carrying it so long you'd forgotten it was there. The town had talked all winter. People had opinions about her and Gideon and what it meant and whether it was proper and what Thomas would have thought. She'd heard most of it secondhand through Margaret Tillis, who delivered it with the guilty relish of someone who considered gossip a form of community service. What she'd come to understand, somewhere in the long dark middle of January, was that people's opinions about her survival were worth exactly as much as the help they'd offered when she'd needed it, which, in most cases, was a nothing. She told Gideon about the conversation that evening. Not the whole weight of it, just the exchange, what she'd said, how it felt. He was quiet for a moment. "You called me your partner." "I did. In front of Harlan." "In front of Harlan." She looked at him. "Is that a problem?" He looked at his hands, the way he did when he was deciding on precision. "No," he said. It's just, I want to make sure we mean the same thing by it. She sat across from him at the table. The lamp was lit, Noah was in bed, the fire was doing its steady work. It was a Tuesday night in April, and it was ordinary, and it was also, she understood, one of those moments that would matter later, the kind you recognized as you were living it, which was rare. What do you mean by it? She asked. He looked up. I mean, I want to be here, not just through the winter, not just until the fences are finished and the barn is solid. I mean, he stopped, tried again. I want to be someone Noah introduces to people as a member of his family. I want to be here in 10 years when this place is producing, and in 20 years when it's established, and whenever it gets hard again, which it will. I want to be the person you call for when something goes wrong. A beat. I know that's a lot to put on a Tuesday in April. It is, she said. It's also... She looked at him steadily. It's also what I meant. He was still. I'm not the same woman I was when Thomas died, she said. I don't think I'm worse or better. I think I'm just different. Harder in some places, softer in others, and a lot less interested in performing things I don't feel. She put her hands flat on the table. I love this homestead. I love Noah. And She took a breath. I've come to love you, Gideon. In the particular way you love someone who has seen you at your least managed and stayed anyway. She almost looked away and didn't. That's not a small thing to me. The fire crackled. Gideon sat very still in the way he went still when something landed somewhere important. I'm not asking for anything tonight, he said finally. His voice was quiet. But I want to ask you something. Not tonight. When it feels right. She understood what he meant. All right, he said, and the word meant the same thing it always meant between them. Enough said, problem settled, forward. He asked on a morning in late May. Not with ceremonies, some. This was Gideon Vale, who showed his meaning through action more than occasion, and Eleanor would not have wanted it any other way. They'd been working together in the garden plot he'd cleared and turned for her in April, extending it east to double the growing area, and she was on her knees in the dirt, putting in bean seeds while he drove stakes for the pole rows. And it was an ordinary working morning with actual warmth in the air, for the first time in what felt like years. And Noah was somewhere behind the barn doing something with a ball and the fence that involved a great deal of focused bouncing. Gideon planted his last stake, looked at the row, then looked at her. Marry me, he said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was standing in the garden dirt with a mallet in his hand and his sleeves rolled up and his face entirely serious and a little bit uncertain, which was the most uncertain she'd ever seen him, and she thought, this is the man who came to a stranger's town and fixed a stranger's fence and chose every single morning to keep choosing it. Yes, she said. He nodded. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically, not the way it would in a story that wanted to wring the sentiment out of the moment, just a quiet letting go, like a man setting down something he'd been bracing against. That's it, Noah said. Both of them turned. He'd come around the corner of the barn at some point. The ball was under his arm, and he was looking at them with the knowing expression of a 9-year-old who had been expecting this development and was mildly disappointed by the lack of production value. Were you listening? Eleanor said. I was in the yard. He gestured at the general vicinity of the yard. You were also in the yard. Voices carry. He looked at Gideon. You're going to be my father now? Gideon met his eyes. If that's all right with you. Noah thought about it for a moment with genuine seriousness, not performing consideration, actually considering. Thomas was my father, he said. I don't want to... He stopped. I don't want to do something wrong by him. Gideon crouched down so he was level with him. You're not doing anything wrong by him. He was your father, and he always will be. That doesn't move. He kept his voice even and his eyes on the boy. I'm not trying to replace him. I'm trying to be something. A different thing. Something new. That can be its own thing without taking anything away from what already was. Noah looked at him for a long moment. Then, he would have liked you, he said. I think. He was practical. He respected practical people. Then I would have liked him too, Gideon said. Noah seemed to accept this as the proper resolution of the matter. He looked at Eleanor, who was still on her knees in the garden dirt, and said, You have dirt on your face. Thank you, Noah. Just saying. He bounced the ball once, caught it, and headed back behind the barn. Eleanor and Gideon looked at each other. Then she laughed. A real one. The kind that came from somewhere unexpected. The kind she hadn't expected to have this morning. And he almost smiled, fully this time, the way he almost never did. And she thought, there it is. There's the thing I was afraid to count on. And it's here, and it's real. And it doesn't look the way I thought it would. Which is probably exactly right. They were married in June, under the cottonwoods along the creek. Not a grand affair. There was no money for grand, and neither of them wanted it. Margaret Tillis came, and the Mercer family from up the creek, and a couple of other homesteaders who'd seen Gideon working and formed their own opinions of him over the winter. The preacher from the next town over said the words and meant them and kept it brief, which Gideon had apparently requested when he'd ridden out to arrange it, a fact Eleanor found perfectly in character. Noah stood beside them. He'd worn his good shirt and combed his hair with water and stood with his hands at his sides in the seriousness of someone performing an important function, because he was. He'd asked Eleanor the night before if he could give her away, and she'd held his face in her hands and said, "You're 9 years old." And he'd said, "I'm almost 10." And she'd said yes because he deserved to stand there and he knew it. When it was done, Eleanor stood under the cottonwoods in the early summer morning, which smelled like creek water and new grass and the bread that Margaret Tillis had brought wrapped in a cloth, and she looked at the homestead, at the solid barn, the straight fences, the extended garden plot with its bean rows already showing green, and thought about the October morning when she'd stood outside Harlan's with her hands shaking and nothing in the basket and winter just getting started. People talk about rock bottom as though it's a place you visit and then leave and never have to think about again. But she knew it wasn't like that. It didn't disappear. It was part of the foundation now. The specific memory of how bad it had gotten was exactly what made her understand the value of what she was standing in. You couldn't know what this morning weighed without knowing what that morning had weighed. Gideon came to stand beside her. He was looking at the same view. He didn't say anything, because he rarely said things that didn't need saying, but he put his hand against the back of her hand and she turned hers over, and they stood there like that, not performing anything for anyone. Just two people looking at a piece of land they decided was worth staying for. "It's not finished," she said. "No," he agreed. "There's still the east drainage problem, and the tack room needs its second wall, and I want to extend the garden again next spring." "I know. And the cabin is too small if—" She stopped. He looked at her sideways. "We have time," she said. "We do," he said. "All of it. We want." Vote. By the end of that summer, the homestead was producing enough that Eleanor paid off the last of Thomas's outstanding debt to a supplier in Cheyenne, a debt she'd been carrying like a stone in her pocket for 16 months, something Thomas had always meant to settle and hadn't gotten to before the accident. She'd written the letter herself and sent the money order herself and sat at the table after and felt the specific lightness of a weight lifted that you'd carried so long you'd stopped noticing it was there. She told Gideon that night. "The Cheyenne debt," she said. "I paid it." He looked up from the harness he was mending. He was always mending something in the evenings, hands busy, mind settled. "All of it?" "All of it." He set the harness down. That's something, Eleanor. It feels like something. It is something." He looked at her with the directness that was one of the first things she'd known about him. "You know that." She did. It wasn't about the money, or not only. It was about the fact that when Thomas died, he'd left some things unfinished. Not from negligence, just from life. From the ordinary incompleteness of a person who dies before they're done. And she'd finished one of them. On her own terms, on her own timeline, with her own hands and the hands of the man she'd chosen. It felt like closing a door gently, not slamming it, honoring what was while walking forward from it. "I miss him," she said. "Still." "I know. That doesn't—" She looked at him. "That doesn't mean anything about us." "I know that too." He picked the harness back up. "You're allowed to miss him and have this. Those aren't the same door." She nodded. That was, she thought, one of the most useful things anyone had ever said to her. What she would think about later when she tried to understand how things had gone from October to June, from the basket in Harlan's to the cottonwoods to the paid debt to the extended garden to the three of them at the supper table every night, like it had always been that way, was this. Nothing happened because it was meant to. She didn't believe in meant to, not after Thomas, not after that winter. Things happened because people showed up and kept showing up, because someone decided a thing was worth doing and then actually did it, over and over, in the cold and the mud and the ordinary days that didn't feel like anything in particular when you were in them. Gideon Vale had walked out of Harlan's general store with a parcel of cornmeal and salt pork and made a choice. A small choice, really. To notice someone else's difficulty and do something about it, not because it was convenient or because there was anything in it for him, but because he'd been hungry before and he understood what it meant. One small choice that had no guarantee attached to it, no promise of outcome, no assurance that the woman with the shaking hands would ever give him anything in return. That was the thing she kept coming back to, not the romance of it. She was too practical for romance as a story, too aware of all the days that weren't romantic, the cold and the debt and the sick weeks and the arguments they had and would keep having because they were two strong-willed people who saw some things differently. But the fact that it had started with such a small, ordinary act of decency, see a need, do a thing, no audience, no reward. Noah was 10 that winter, and growing fast in the way boys do when they're fed consistently and sleeping well and feel like they're allowed to take up space. He'd started doing real work on the homestead, not child work, not busy work, but the actual tasks of a property that needed tending, taken seriously and done with the particular pride of someone who understood that his contribution mattered. He talked about Thomas sometimes, more freely now, with the specific quality of someone carrying a memory that had found its right size. Not smaller than it was, not larger, just the true size of a person who was gone, but not absent. One evening, he was helping Gideon split firewood. He could manage a splitting maul now, with supervision, which Gideon had started teaching him with the same patient seriousness he brought to everything. And Eleanor was watching from the porch, and Noah landed a clean split and looked up with the involuntary satisfaction of it and said, "Papa would have liked this, seen this, I think." Gideon rested the maul. "You think he's watching?" "I don't know," Noah said with the careful honesty of a child who had decided not to say things he wasn't sure of. "Maybe, but even if he's not," he looked at the split wood, "even if he can't see it, it's still good. It doesn't need him to see it to be good." Eleanor stood on the porch and felt something move through her that she didn't try to name. She'd spent a long time waiting for the moment when things would feel right, when she'd know she'd made the correct choices, when the fear would finally lift enough to call it safe. She'd been waiting for certainty, and certainty hadn't come. It never came. That was the thing the frontier had taught her and kept teaching her, that there was no such thing as safe, not finally, not in any permanent way. But there was this. There was a boy landing a clean split and knowing it was good even without someone to confirm it. There was a man who'd come from a distance and stayed. There was a north wall that held against the cold, and a garden that had doubled, and a debt that was paid, and a morning in June under the cottonwoods when she'd said yes and meant all of it. You didn't get certainty. What you got, if you were lucky and brave enough to keep showing up, was a life that was actually yours. Built from the real materials, the ones that had been through weather and were stronger for it, not the imagined ones that looked good until they were tested. She went down off the porch and picked up the log ends and stacked them in the wheelbarrow, because there was always something to do, and doing it was the point. "Supper in an hour," she said. "We'll be done by then," Gideon said. She believed him. She'd gotten good at believing the things he said, which had required first getting good at paying attention to whether the things people said matched the things they did. With Gideon, they matched. Not perfectly. He was impatient with inefficiency and stubborn about his own methods, and had a habit of fixing things without telling her what he'd found wrong, which irritated her more than it should have. He wasn't a perfect man. He was a consistent one. She'd learned over that year that consistent was rare and worth more. The cottonwoods were gold by October again, 1 full year from the morning in Harlan's store, though Eleanor didn't mark it consciously, just felt it as the season turned and recognized something in the smell of the cold coming in off the flats. The homestead had made it through a summer of production that had given them enough to put away properly, enough that the tin box under the floorboard had a different weight to it than it had a year ago, enough that she'd bought Noah new boots that fit and replaced the 2 windows with cracked frames and still had something left over. Not wealthy, not easy, but not standing in a general store with an empty basket and a hungry child and nowhere to turn. That was the distance. 1 year. 1 year of consistent work, consistent presence, consistent choosing to stay even when leaving was an option. And that was the distance between those 2 points. She thought sometimes about what she would say to the woman who'd walked out of Harlan's with her hand shaking. She thought, I would tell her it gets better, but not because something magical happens. I would tell her it gets better because she keeps going and because she's willing, eventually, to let someone help carry it. I would tell her that asking for help is not the same as failing, that knowing when you can't do something alone is actually a form of intelligence, not weakness. I would tell her that the fear doesn't leave, but it changes shape. I would tell her, the man with the cornmeal is real. Let him in. Noah came around the barn in the late afternoon light and stood beside her and looked at the cottonwoods going gold along the creek. Same as last year, he said. Not really, she said. He looked at her, then looked at the yard, at the solid barn, at Gideon crossing the distance from the tack room with a tool in his hand, at the extended garden plot now put to bed for winter, at the cabin with its working windows and its rechunked walls and the chimney putting up a straight line of smoke in the still October air. No, he agreed. Not really. Gideon came up and stopped beside them, looked at whatever they were looking at, and then looked at Eleanor. She reached over without thinking about it and fixed the collar of Noah's coat, and Noah let her, and Gideon watched this the way he watched things he wanted to keep, with careful, private attention, filing it somewhere. Fence on the north corner needs looking at before the freeze, he said. I know, Eleanor said. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, he agreed. The three of them stood in the October evening and looked at a homestead that had been failing a year ago and was not failing now. Not fixed, not finished, never finished, but alive and working and tended by people who had decided it was worth the work. That was all. That was the whole of it. On the Wyoming frontier in 1883, that was everything. The winter was coming again. It always came again. But this time the wood was split and stacked high, the walls were solid, the cupboard had weight in it, and the family that had built all of this, out of desperation and chance, and one stranger's small act of decency, and one woman's stubborn refusal to stop, was standing in the yard in the evening light, together, ready for whatever the land sent next. Not because they weren't afraid, but because they'd learned that fear and forward weren't opposites. You could hold both. You could be afraid and stay anyway, and sometimes staying was the whole story. Sometimes staying was enough.